Could a breathtaking amount of American taxpayer money, we're talking potentially billions, have been systematically stolen only to be funneled overseas and possibly contribute to international security threats?
It sounds like the plot of a movie. But, based on the extensive stack of sources you provided, this isn't fiction. This is an alleged real-time breakdown of financial integrity.
Yeah, and it's rooted in a single American state, but with these massive global consequences.
Exactly.
That's right. You sent us these really detailed sources about what is alleged to be a massive financial fraud scheme starting in Minnesota. So our mission today is clear. We're doing a deep dive into the shocking scale of this alleged theft.
And we have to analyze the critical breakdowns, the failures in accountability, transparency, and integrity that reportedly made it all possible.
And we'll explore how these domestic failures kind of mirror those seen in some of the world's most fragile states. It's a scary parallel.
The scope of the allegations alone, it demands your attention. The figures force you to look beyond simple theft and really ask, how on earth did the system allow this to happen?
Okay, so here's the initial shocker that just sets the stage. Over a period of years, the sources allege that up to $9 billion.
$9 billion. It's a number that's hard to even conceptualize.
It is, and that figure could represent half of Minnesota's total $18 billion Medicaid expenditure. It was allegedly stolen through a coordinated set of fraudulent welfare programs.
And this money, we're told, was siphoned off using this, what the sources call a fraud pipeline, that basically just converted public funds into suitcases of cash.
And this is where that domestic failure connects to these global concerns. The sources contain these deeply concerning claims that this immense stream of cash was laundered, transferred out of the U.S.
Potentially supporting terror organizations like Al-Shabaab in East Africa.
Yeah.
I mean, it illustrates a direct and pretty dangerous link between failures in state-level governance and, significant international security risks.
Okay. Let's unpack the mechanism of the fraud, starting right there in Minnesota. One of the most telling details in all the source material is how this scheme was reportedly exposed.
Yeah, this part is wild.
It wasn't some big task force or a high-level auditing firm or even the state's own regulatory agencies that sounded the alarm.
No, not at all. The sources really highlight that the initial exposure came from a 23-year-old independent online journalist, a guy named Nick Shirley. His work was, it was basically just street-level investigation.
The kind of thing you'd expect officials to be doing.
Exactly. The kind of thing that sources imply should have been done by state officials responsible for oversight.
Yeah.
Which, it strongly suggests that state officials were either grossly negligent or
worse, as some sources allege, maybe actively avoiding looking too closely.
Right. And the core of the theft was just so brazen, the daycare scheme. We're talking about alleged fraudsters using empty storefronts, commercial properties.
Getting them licensed as full-capacity childcare centers and then billing the state for hundreds of children who just didn't exist.
This wasn't petty theft. It was systematic, organized exploitation of a system that's supposed to provide aid to people who need it.
And to put the scale into concrete terms, the sources cite 3 investigated centers that collectively received $9.3 million.
And one of those facilities, called Sweet Angel Childcare, licensed for 74 kids, was paid $1.26 million in a single fiscal year.
But when that independent journalist actually showed up, what did he find?
Blacked out windows, locked doors during business hours, absolutely no signs of children, no activity, nothing.
The sources point out the sheer absurdity of it. One center, licensed for 99 children and getting nearly $2 million in 1 year, reportedly misspelled the word learning on its own sign.
The simplicity of the alleged scheme is really the most damning proof of the system's breakdown. The sources say over and over that any government inspector just doing a basic walk-by would have immediately seen that these were phantom facilities.
They were blocks apart, run by people from the same community.
And all allegedly empty. This level of alleged fraud, it doesn't just require bad actors. It requires a state system that is completely, utterly withdrawn basic oversight.
Now, the pipeline wasn't just limited to daycares. The sources detail a rapid expansion into other programs. For example, in home health care.
Oh yeah, this part. Investigators reportedly identified 14 identical healthcare companies operating out of a single building.
14. All allegedly siphoning $50 to $60 million every single year.
And then there's the incredible inflation in Medicaid payments for autism services. According to the documents you shared, these payments just shot up from what, 1.3 million in 2017?
To an astronomical 228 million by 2024.
That's not organic growth. That's a statistical indicator just screaming that the program has been massively exploited, likely for fraud. Any functioning oversight mechanism should have seen that line graph spike and immediately triggered a full audit.
And this leads us to the explosive political dimension detailed in the source material. The sources make some specific and very highly charged allegations about a relationship between the alleged fraudsters and certain elected officials.
And it is crucial to be clear here. These are allegations contained within the sources provided. We're reporting what's in the documents.
Absolutely.
Those sources claim there was a reciprocal cycle. They allege Democrat politicians facilitated the funneling of money to the fraudsters, who then allegedly returned thousands or even millions of dollars in political donations or campaign support.
Right, to those same politicians, including, as the source's name, Governor Walz.
The narrative presented is that this financial political feedback loop enabled the entire scheme to continue completely unchecked.
And the conclusion drawn in those sources is that political leaders weren't just passive victims of fraud, but that they had an active skin in the game to allow the fraud to continue for, votes and funding. Again, we are reporting that this highly sensitive claim is in the documentation we reviewed without endorsing its truth.
So the sheer volume of cash that this alleged scheme generated, it required a huge money transfer operation. We see evidence of hundreds of millions of dollars being funneled out of the U.S.
And the sources specifically cite the Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport as a key hub, alleging nearly $750 million in cash was moved through that one facility.
In just 2 years, between 2024 and 2025. Just think about that amount of physical cash.
That movement brings us back to that international connection and the terror funding link. The highly sensitive claim is that these funds were diverted to East Africa via money transfer businesses, MTBs, and could be supporting the terrorist organization Al-Shabaab.
And we should probably pause here to clarify some of the financial architecture the sources describe. These funds were allegedly moved through what are called money service businesses, or MSBs.
Right. These are licensed businesses that offer financial services like money transfers and check cashing.
Exactly. The specific subset, the MTBs, are the ones that handle the physical movement of cash overseas. And the sources indicate that counterterrorism flags related to these transfers were raised way back between 2016 and 2018.
But the tracking trail reportedly went cold once the money reached Dubai.
So this isn't just internal state mismanagement anymore. It's being treated as an international financial crime, which leads to the federal counterattack.
Yes. The sources include details of the response announced by U.S. Treasury Secretary Bessent, who reportedly framed this alleged fraud in the same way you talk about drug cartels and organized money laundering.
And the federal response was decisive, according to the source material. The Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, gave formal notification to several of those money service businesses, the MSBs, that they're under investigation
And the reason?
for allegedly failing to comply with crucial anti-money laundering laws. The very laws designed to protect the U.S. financial system from this kind of illicit cash.
And to really put the brakes on the flow, FinCEN issued a geographical targeting order, or a GTO, for Hennepin and Ramsey counties in Minnesota.
Which is a big deal. It's a significant regulatory action that lowers the threshold for surveillance and mandatory reporting on international money transfers to just $3,000.
So they put a real spotlight on every single transaction leaving those counties.
They did. And Secretary Bessent, according to the sources, made it very clear that the Minnesota investigations would serve as the genesis for a national rollout.
Which emphasizes that the federal government sees this alleged local welfare theft not as a local problem, but as a major financial crime demanding the same tools used against cartels.
Right, and transnational criminal organizations. It's a whole different level of threat.
This is where we need to pivot. We've talked about the sheer scale of the alleged crime. Now we need to look at the systemic reasons it was even possible.
We have to look at the structural foundation that failed, because the sources that give us this kind of analytical roadmap for financial integrity.
And it creates that painful parallel we mentioned earlier, comparing the governance failures in a prosperous state like Minnesota to those in a fragile state like Somalia.
Exactly. The sources detail three mutually reinforcing pillars that form the theoretical baseline for good governance and financial integrity anywhere in the world. When these pillars crumble, corruption flourishes.
And those pillars are accountability, transparency, and integrity.
The big three.
So let's, move beyond the textbook definition and apply these directly to the Minnesota case. First, accountability. It's about being answerable for actions taken and making sure responsibility is delivered.
In the Minnesota context, the alleged failure of accountability is just. It's profound. If state employees or auditors were responsible for spot-checking these daycare centers, and those centers were perpetually empty.
Then the lack of follow-up, the lack of anyone being held answerable for verifying where billions of dollars were going, that's the collapse of this first pillar.
It's a structural failure. The allegation is that nobody was held accountable for simply doing their job.
Okay, next pillar, transparency. This means providing free access to governmental activities so that citizens, journalists, anyone can actually monitor policies and outcomes.
And the alleged failure of transparency is so evident in the explosive growth of specific programs like the autism service payments.
Soaring from 1.3 million to 228 million.
Yes. If the data on where those payments were going, or who owned those 14 identical healthcare companies, had been transparent and easy for the public to scrutinize, the sheer volume of the alleged fraud might have been spotted by watchdogs long before a journalist had to go knocking on doors.
So a lack of sunlight allowed the alleged fraud to just grow in the shadows.
Precisely. And that brings us to the final pillar, integrity. This is the use of public resources for their authorized purposes, characterized by honesty and trustworthiness.
And this speaks directly to that alleged political dimension.
It does. If the claims are true that politicians knowingly allowed these fraudulent systems to continue in exchange for campaign funding, there's a catastrophic failure of integrity at the highest level.
The public trust, the whole idea that officials are using public resources honestly, it just vanishes. The system becomes an alleged feeding trough for criminal interests.
The sources are crystal clear. A properly functioning integrity system is the essential barricade against corruption. A weak system built on the failure of those three pillars inevitably leads to endemic corruption, fraud, waste, and abuse on the kind of scale we see alleged in Minnesota.
And this is exactly the struggle in fragile states. The sources note that in Somalia, corruption and insecurity are acute problems. The nation ranked last out of 180 countries on the Corruption Perception Index in both 2017 and 2018.
And the sources emphasize that for Somalia to build public trust after decades of conflict, restoring these three pillars, accountability, transparency, and integrity, is their single most important task.
It's just a chilling comparison, isn't it? The alleged systemic failure in a stable American state, where basic checks were reportedly abandoned, starts to look terrifyingly similar to the governance problems in the world's most fragile states, where institutional collapse is the norm.
This analysis leads directly into how governance fails not just in welfare, but in the really complex world of global aid directed toward places like Somalia.
And the sources make a crucial academic distinction here that's often ignored: diversion versus corruption.
Right. Diversion is aid that just doesn't reach the intended recipient. It's simple theft. Corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain, like taking a bribe. They're often conflated, but they're not always the same thing.
And here's where the critique of the aid system gets really fascinating. The sources assert that aid diversion and corruption aren't anomalies in conflict zones like Somalia or Afghanistan.
No, they're a long-standing norm, and this is driven by systemic practices within the aid delivery system itself. It's not just about a few individual bad actors. It's a failure that's almost built into the structure.
So the standard governance practices in aid distribution become these critical entry points for corruption. Let's look at targeting, for instance.
Yeah, aid needs to get to the truly needy, but the technical process for targeting is highly vulnerable to local politics. In Somalia, the sources detail how local gatekeepers' authorities, camp managers, allegedly profit from internally displaced persons.
And they profit substantially. The sources claim these gatekeepers allegedly take up to 50% of cash or voucher entitlement.
50%.
Half of the money intended for people in desperate need. That enormous tax on desperation is a clear demonstration of failed transparency and accountability at the local level.
And then you have the complexity of subcontracting and monitoring. The aid delivery structure is layered. Donor to the UN, to international NGOs, then finally to local NGOs.
This multi-layered bureaucracy passes risk down the chain, leading to a rationale that the sources describe as don't ask, don't tell.
The pressure on the people on the ground is intense. Deliver results, show success, keep the money flowing. This pressure, according to the sources, makes ethical compromises almost inevitable.
And the tool that's supposed to stop this third-party monitoring, or TPMs, often becomes nothing more than a tick-box approach.
Right. The monitors themselves, the ones hired to mitigate fraud, face these intense conflicts of interest. Their contracts often depend on reporting success, and they fear reporting negative findings.
In some cases, the sources even suggest collusion with local actors. The entire oversight system ends up prioritizing bureaucratic continuity over genuine integrity.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, navigating a world that's just overloaded with information? The alleged breakdown in Minneapolis, resulting in billions stolen and cash funneled overseas? Well, it reflects a profound and catastrophic failure in those foundational pillars of governance.
Accountability, transparency, and integrity.
The systems that were meant to protect taxpayer dollars and vulnerable people, they just collapsed. They created a vulnerability that spans from empty storefronts in Minnesota all the way to alleged terror financing in East Africa.
The sources force us to conclude that the difference between outright organized crime and a systemic breakdown in governance is vanishingly small when oversight is removed or, politically compromised.
You have to consider what happens to a seemingly prosperous American democracy when its institutions of financial control fail so spectacularly that its reported governance dysfunctions start to mimic those of the most fragile states in the world.
The lesson here is brutal and absolutely clear. The failure to enforce basic transparency, the failure to check the books, the failure to hold officials accountable for billions of dollars, is that just an administrative error?
Or, as the sheer scale of this alleged Minnesota theft suggests, is the erosion of those three pillars an explicit standing invitation to endemic corruption that costs us not just money, but potentially our security?